Thank you for downloading from the BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Now on BBC World Service, Will Storr continues his series examining rape as a weapon of war in the second part of An Unspeakable Act. There are parts of this programme that listeners may find disturbing.
I
was just screaming and Faimo was just laughing. He just used me as a woman.
Ile wakati nikisani ilikuwa mwezi wa 12, ilikuwa le 25, kuna weli na weli. Ilikuwa kasikia
nakage umva mubire kule winja. Lero urengera kwa mango njanya mu mwezi kwa kishira. Kuna kisha kidogo.
sisi pila msiku mbili kwa sikia hivi.
ilikuwa usiku. I'm here in a dusty street in old Kampala, which is the capital of Uganda, the country that thousands upon thousands of refugees flee to every year, trying to escape the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the street opposite the headquarters of the Refugee Law Project, charcoal sellers ply their trade. Enormous marabou stalks are circling above the golden domes of the Gaddafi Mosque, and refugees mill about in their dozens outside the centre, waiting for their time of their appointment. I'm here to meet director Dr. Chris Dolan, who's the man who's pioneered the research and the campaign to recognise that victims of sexual violence can be male as well as female. Chris.
Hi.
Will Storr from the BBC. How are you?
Good to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you too.
When I came to Refugee Law Project in 2006, we started having a lot of work with women who were survivors of sexual violence. And in the middle of 2009 was when we organised a workshop specifically for men. We put posters up around the office announcing the workshop, and 150 men came. And several men approached me directly after that workshop and said, this is something that happened to me, and I've never really talked about it before. And so then we began a process of actually interviewing people. We then realized that many of the men who were coming forward with their story, had been holding on to it sometimes for 4 or 5 years or even longer. At the same time as they had never told the story, they'd never actually even accessed medical treatment for what had happened to them. And given the levels of violence involved, you can imagine that some of the injuries are pretty serious.
Could you give me a sense of what kinds of injuries they suffer and what kind of state they'll be in when they arrive?
Whether it's a single rape or a gang rape, there's serious damage to the anus to the point where people are incontinent and wearing nappies. Often there are secondary infections that set in because the wound has never been treated. Some cases you get rape where the rape has actually been effected using an instrument such as a screwdriver. We had one case where that happened, where all the different wounds from the different places where the screwdriver had been pushed through his muscles and so on, they were open. So he had multiple points at which he was incontinent, if you like.
So he was defecating through his wounds?
Yeah.
I was married in 2004 and we had 2 kids. In 2008, in July, we were attacked by people who were in uniform. These people, when they came, I went to the door and they tied me up, my head put in my legs, my arms bound for almost 3 hours. Okay, I was beaten up and they killed my father in my presence and my mother and my 2 little ones. They were cut off, their heads were put aside. It was sad for me, but still I had to continue with life. In 2010, I was attacked again. These same people who came in uniform, and this time the agenda was to take me out because they had heard I was alive. Then they tied my eyes with a handkerchief and they took me with them into their van. When I arrived in Nyaleke, I found there other prisoners, and it was like a barracks. But in that time where I was in Nyaleke, I got a serious problem because one of those guys was like, I can't just let him go. He needs to pass in more pain. This guy took me into his office and this is where I was. I was used as a woman without my permission, on serious pain, tortures and beats. It took me almost like 4 to 5 days unconscious because I wasn't used to that and it wasn't my will. And all this time they were saying the only thing we can do now, let this guy disappear. They threw me again in the van, and again on the way they stopped, and this guy said again, I have to injure him one more time. So it was another pain again. When he took my trouser off, and I was just screaming, and for him I was just laughing. Then he just did whatever he wanted, and he just used me as a woman. I've never had never even any idea about this. It was so painful to me. I even tried to say even late, at least if he had cut my head off rather than doing this to me. But for him, he was enjoying, he was laughing. Maybe they thought I was dead. They left. I don't know why. Maybe I have to die and nobody will find over my body. And suddenly there was a car crossing by. I asked them if they can transport me to anywhere. And this guy told me, maybe if we go, but we can drop you maybe in Kampala. I said, I don't see any future for this. I don't see any. I know where it's going. My back is not healed. Which sickness is this I have? There's too much. And it comes to my mind is, I would rather die than living.
I photographed this man in silhouette. Outside the door, 20 or so other nameless, faceless men waited to share their stories and to have their blacked-out portraits taken. To identify these men would be to put their lives at risk. What happened to them in a Western context is a crime as great as that against women. But in this part of Africa,
because there's no understanding of non-consensual sex between men, any sex between men is regarded as a crime, and both the men involved are seen as parties to the crime.
Chris Dolan again.
So basically what we would understand as a rape in the law is not understood as a rape. It's just understood as an act against the order of nature, which was a phrase which I believe the British brought in their colonial administration. But the problem is basically that simple, that you can't actually go to the police and lay a charge against somebody else for rape. It's the fact of being receptive, and which is interpreted as passive, which is interpreted as being the role of a woman, that makes you a homosexual.
It is harrowing, but relatively common to hear the experiences of women who have suffered from sexual violence. But to what extent does it affect men? Lara Stempel is an academic at the University of California's Health and Human Rights Project.
In terms of solid data, there was a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association which looked at this phenomenon in the eastern region of the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2010, and they found that 30% of all women and 22% of all men, not just combatants, in that region were reporting conflict-related sexual violence. So just astonishingly high numbers for both.
The author of that study, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, was Dr. Lynn Lowry of the Harvard Medical School. I wondered what sort of reaction her paper received.
Interesting, the response that we got was some negative, or a lot of negative, and a lot of controversy, and some sort of positive puzzling because they didn't quite know what to do with the numbers.
When you first started coming across the numbers involved, were you shocked and surprised?
I think I was shocked at the level of female perpetration, but I think I was more shocked and surprised at the anger of the advocacy communities and the NGO communities had towards having these statistics out there as if I had, opened some box and let out the big secret.
The UN has neglected the issue of sexual violence against men and boys for many years. We can understand this pattern in its historical context, which is that in the early decades of the international human rights movement, women's issues were largely neglected, and this was really challenged in the 1980s and significantly so in the 1990s by the international women's human rights movement, which began to demand attention to women's issues. And the issue of rape was used as a key harm that was effective at galvanizing support for women's human rights. And so because of this, when rape was finally attended to by the United Nations, it was treated as a women's issue.
So it's not simply that men are being ignored, it's even on the level of the language used in legal documents. Rape is being defined as something that only happens to women and girls.
In general, in UN instruments, rape is being defined as something that only impacts women and girls. One study that I came across reviewed more than 4,000 different non-governmental organizations, and of those 4,000, only 3% even mentioned the experience of males, and even those that did only included men as a passing reference.
I think the problem is that the advocacy groups spend so much time advocating for an issue that they're so afraid if you come up with something that is against the issue, that money will then be taken away. And what we're saying is we don't want money to be taken away. We want men to have the same access.
Most funders have a set of line items, if you like, that they will fund. And at present, there are no funders that are saying, we would welcome proposals to deal with male survivors of sexual violence.
Why?
Because the entire discourse around sexual violence is entirely focused on, often on women and children lumped together.
So ironically, gender workers have been behaving in an extraordinarily sexist way.
I think you've put it quite well. It is very paradoxical and, to my mind, rather perverse that a gender discourse which is supposed to unpick power relationships actually ends up reaffirming the very model that is trying to undermine by saying, women are vulnerable and men are not.
What the data showed was that men had suffered sexual violence in DRC over the course of 16 years was 23%. But some of the other things that we found were that the perpetrators were not always men. So if you asked the survivors of sexual violence that were female, 40% of them reported that their perpetrator was female, and 10% of men who had suffered sexual violence reported that their perpetrator was female. Most of what the men reported when they had female perpetrators was instrumentation and mutilation. Some of the interesting things were forced circumcisions on some of the men. Some of them were castrated. We also had men whose genitals were cut or cut off.
If the UN and the NGO community find it difficult to accept that men can be raped by men, what do they think of reports of female perpetrators?
It's a very controversial finding, and it's very problematic for women's rights activists. I think that it really challenges some of the assumptions that we have about male perpetration. If we leave intact this idea that men are always perpetrators, that really perpetuates this idea that men have to act in a certain way in order to, quote-unquote, be a man.
This denial by the UN and NGOs of the numbers and effects of male sexual violence is echoed in organisations that are based in the DRC.
Welcome, Karibu.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
Café.
Hi. Merci. Bonjour. Vous êtes les bienvenus.
Okay, hello, you are welcome. Here you are at SARCAF.
SARCAF est une organisation.
SARCAF is an organization that defends the interest of the woman.
So, Noel, obviously this morning we heard a great deal about the work of SARCAF. You talk a lot about women. Why do you not talk about male survivors?
Oui, je n'ai pas fini.
I did not talk about the men because I can say that about the rape, we have 99% of women. Of course, the men also suffer. We have seen those who have been injured, they suffer, they have been tortured, but we cannot really say that they are affected the way the women are.
A 2010 survey published in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that 22% of men have been victims of sexual violence. These are very different figures from the ones you quote.
Ça dépend.
The percentage you give about the women and the men, I really cannot say that concerns all the country. Maybe what you heard concerned only a given region of the country. But if I talk about the eastern part, and that is almost all the country, I really cannot say that the men were raped at 20%. That cannot be right. It was really a little percent.
The CBCA programme is a link between the loyal DRC Army and the Baptist Church. Its aim is to give soldiers human rights training and to end the practice of sexual violence. They say that their programme has been successful, but others say this isn't so, and that the programme is a smokescreen whose aim is to retain international aid and to gain support for the government.
My name is Lieutenant Colonel Mohima Bosanga. I was chosen to train my brother soldiers in an awareness program about sexual violence.
Why has it become such a problem in DRC that we hear a lot about soldiers committing acts of rape upon civilians?
You are confused between the loyal army groups and the rebel groups. In reality, the loyal army has been retrained and do not commit these crimes. There is a confusion simply because the rebel groups wear the same uniforms as the government army.
But we have been hearing from NGOs that both loyal army groups and rebel groups are all involved in these issues. So I don't accept that loyal army groups are not involved in this.
NGOs will exaggerate their reports in order to get more funding. They will organise meetings, and in order to get people to come, they will offer them medical and financial help. There may be cases where, for example, a village is attacked and 30 or so are raped, but the NGOs will inflate that number to 400 cases.
In the cases that we have been addressing, particularly the cases which involve male victims, there cannot be any doubt that they have suffered a rape because they present to the NGOs with terrible injuries, anal injuries. Some of them say the rebels did this to me, but many also, including ones that we have spoken to, have said that the army did this to me.
Look, people are fully prepared to tell lies to guests and visitors like you. They may even weep in front of you, and you, of course, will say this is a serious case. But will you take time to check this story?
My name is Salome Atim. I have been working at the Refugee Law Project for 4 years as a gender officer.
I was wondering, Salome, what were your initial impressions when you first heard men reporting these terrible atrocities?
I was sad. I was shocked. I say, funny enough, I think I kept on looking at my son and imagining these things happening to him. And as I talked to the clients and saw how much they were struggling with these emotions, I realized they were really suffering. Internally, they were dying. And they just needed someone to reach out to them and help.
What is the case that has disturbed you most?
There's a young boy. His father was actually a journalist. He broadcast some news on what was happening at that time in the DRC. And so they managed to trace their home. And when they came, they arranged the children opposite the mother. They opened her wide. They raped her in turns. She started bleeding until she passed out when they were watching. And after that, they took their father outside. They shot him. So they came back to him and they told him, if you don't do what we want you to do, we'll shoot you next. And they told me, rape your brother. And he did not understand when they said rape. So he remained looking at them. So they beat his penis. and started crying. They told him that push here. So they pulled him closer to the brother. Of course, the brother was bleeding. And they were trying to force him to penetrate the brother from behind. So he said, because I had never had sex before, I was just not erecting. And this made them so mad, and they really beat me so bad. They beat me so bad. They beat the tip of the penis until the tip was almost, all bleeding and like missed meat at the top there. And after that, they did not stop there. They turned him the other way side, and actually they raped him. And they raped him one after another, and he just passed out. Next, they went to the younger brother, who by then maybe was like 8 years. They did the same.
Denials from the army are bad enough, but denials from charities and aid agencies who work on the ground and are funded by Western bodies are profoundly troubling. Unless things change, denial will cause them to remain the silent victims of war, innocent people who have survived what will surely remain an unspeakable act.
They tied us, they obliged us to kneel down. So, 3 persons have been raping me.
They take us in the bush and they told me to kneel down.
Have been raping my young brother Patrick.
They were 8 soldiers.
They have been raping us,
and
it was so painful.
They raped us.
Killings going on in my homeland. Sometimes you hear 20 died, 15 missed, someone was killed.
Then the army came and got into my house.
I often find myself listening to people talking, and I feel as though I'm about to cry. And I don't, because I've also been socialized not to cry in public.
After raping me, they killed my husband and all my sister.
I don't know what human rights can do to assist in Congo, as the Congolese themselves, to get to know that human is human. Because the generation is dying. Maybe we need civilization and knowledge.
They will kill you. Killing people in our country just like a joke. And if you are dead, no one will make even an investigation for your death.
Everybody knows who these people are and what they are doing. And yet, what is the international community doing?
Je pense que nous tous nous sommes.
At times I wonder if anyone cares.
I think we are all involved. We are all complices, if I can say. Because we all know the problem, but we all stay quiet. Nothing is done. So the day everybody will say, okay, I knew, but I did nothing.
I don't think that peace will come in the near future.
I feel wounded, and I understand that the government is tired because they are doing nothing at all. I feel wounded in my heart.
An Unspeakable Act was produced by Terry Lewis, with thanks to Christian Aid and the Refugee Law Project. The program was a Tinderbox production for BBC World Service.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.